Hello and welcome to the Summer of Ishq, a series of 6 webinars curated and brought to you by the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. My name is Madhavi Menon and I'm director of the center. Summer of Ishq is a hot extension of our flagship speaker series, Ishq, which as a word in Hindustani translates into love, desire, passion, and as an acronym, Issues in Society, History, Queerness, allows us to theorize and politicize that passion. We're going to have, as I said before, a series of 6 webinars this summer, starting today with the one on rights and continuing next week into law, borders, politics, cinema, and education. Today we have 2 speakers with us who I will introduce very soon, but first a note on the format of the session. Each speaker will speak on the subject for about 10 minutes in response to a question that we've given them, after which they will have a conversation with each other for 10 minutes, and following that we will have 30 minutes of Q&A from audience members like yourselves. At any point in the next hour, please press the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen if you would like to pose a question for the speakers. The question for today that we are thinking about and have posed to our speakers already is sexuality a right? Going to be addressed by 2 of our wonderful speakers today. The first of whom is Professor Judith Butler, who is Maxine Elliot Professor of Comparative Literature and Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley, and Professor Ratna Kapur, who is Professor of International Law at Queen Mary College, University of London. Before you start listening to Judith Butler's comments, I'd like to say that these first 10 minutes of this segment have been recreated owing to a technical glitch. Enjoy.
Yes, hello. This is my second time trying to give the opening remarks for this wonderful event at Ashoka University. We lost the opening sequence for technical reasons, so here I am again in slightly different clothes, but with the same ideas. First, I want to thank Ashoka University for hosting this conversation, and I'm particularly pleased to be in conversation with Professor Ratna Kapur, whose work on human rights and sexuality and rights discourse more broadly has been very powerful in reshaping the paradigms within which we think these problems. So it's a great honor for me, and I look forward to our conversation. When we ask the question whether sexuality is a right, we immediately have a problem. In other words, what is sexuality, and is it the kind of thing that can become a right? What is a right? Is it a human right? Is it a natural right? Is it a right according to positive and codified law? What do we mean when we say a right? And that becomes more difficult when we consider that very often rights discourse appears to belong to individuals. This individual has a right, you have a right to your sexuality, I have a right to my sexuality. And we speak that way, and of course we must speak that way, especially in the face of those who would deprive us of that right or attack us or discriminate against us on the basis of sexuality. So we do speak that way, linking rights to our individuality as a person. And yet sexuality may not really be the kind of thing that corresponds with existing notions of personal liberty. I mean, there is the question, first of all, do I choose my sexuality? Probably not. One's sexuality is formed and is lived according to cultural norms and historical circumstances of various kinds, and very often the way we desire or the forms of sexuality in which we engage are culturally and historically situated. They're not just my individual liberty expressing itself decontextualized from history and culture. And yet, in front of the law, sometimes we must act as individuals who have a right. I should be free to express my sexuality as I please. So we give ourselves a political freedom to express this sexuality that we may or may not freely choose. Maybe we freely affirm it, but that doesn't mean it's constructed out of our choice. Probably not. At least I'm pretty sure not. In any case, rights discourse is complicated because on the one hand, we do need it. So I will end up arguing that yes, sexuality is a right. On the other hand, rights discourse is not always situated within a larger political movement. It doesn't, to the degree that it's individualizing or decontextualizing, it doesn't actually locate discrimination, violence, censorship within a broader political context, and rights themselves are not necessarily linked to rights discourse, or rights assertions are not necessarily linked with social movements for justice and equality and freedom. So they tend to take us out of context, and they tend to treat us as individuals, and yet whose sexuality is really radically decontextualized, and whose sexuality is really even individual. We talk about my sexuality, but I'm also formed culturally, and I share certain aspects with others, and those issues are not always easily addressable through the concept of rights. In fact, my own view is that sexuality should be thought of less as an individual attribute and disposition than as a relation. I think sexuality is relational. Even if it's a relation to myself, it's still relational. It's a way of articulating and living a relation of some kind. So one question is, can there be a relational understanding of rights? And I believe that Professor Kapur's work can help us with that. A relational conception of rights would, I believe, have the advantage of displacing personal liberty as the presumptive background for rights discourse. And it would also ask, what role does rights discourse have in a struggle for social equality? What role does rights discourse have in a struggle against institutional violence? And there, I think, when we contextualize the right to sexuality as a right to live, the right to live a livable life, then we are already thinking about broader categories, since a livable life is surely a life with others, and a life lived with others without fear of retaliation, violence, discrimination. So, of course, I have seen how human rights discourse has worked in Latin America. Some people have been very pleased to see human rights come in as a way to counter dictatorship, or as a way to counter femicide or feminicidio, the violence against women and trans men and anyone who is feminized under a particular cultural regime. And in those cases, human rights can interrupt a local culture which is either taking for granted or reproducing forms of social violence that are unacceptable. On the other hand, human rights, as we know, can be among the worst forms of cultural imperialism, ways of insisting that any number of cultures conform to Western Northern standards, and are very often rejected precisely because they are understood as tokens of imperialism. How do we work between those poles, the necessity for a rights discourse, the understanding that it is, in fact, quite limited and even sometimes quite dangerous?
Example, let's look at, say, the decriminalization of homosexuality, or the recognition of, say, same-sex marriage in some contexts, or where they're moving towards a same-sex marriage. These are extremely important moments for shifting public and social and even familial family perceptions of not only what are acceptable sexual practices, but also which sexual subjects are also acceptable, or at least to be tolerated. And I think what this does is it accords same-sex marriage or decriminalization of homosexuality certainly is important, because it gives a sense of belonging and perhaps even stability, even a sense of normalcy to, say, gays and lesbians who have made these or launched these rights claims. At the same time, however, it also incorporates gays and lesbians into an institution which is very much a part of the marriage market economy on the one hand, but also an institution that continues to be policed by social and cultural and even familial norms and other institutional arrangements. And these mechanisms, these policing mechanisms, I think they govern and monitor how marriage then is to be conducted, how it's to be understood. For example, marriage in India includes the exemption of marital rape. And also the idea that there are no, it's also attention that these interventions, excuse me, can you hear me? Can you hear me still? Hello? You can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay. What's important is I think that these policing mechanisms also are in the hands of dominant caste, religious, majoritarian groups who do target, say, intercaste and interreligious arrangements or marriages. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of women's sexual rights and the way in which the right to sexual autonomy and bodily integrity has been so important to the women's human rights campaigns and have translated into a global focus on violence against women, which is incredibly significant because it's resulted in bringing the private arena where sexual violence has taken place under human rights scrutiny. And that's an extraordinary achievement in terms of the recognition of women's sexual subjectivity. At the same time, however, these claims have also been translated into largely into criminal law and have also strengthened, say, the state's security apparatus and law and order mechanisms as well, which aren't necessarily liberating. In fact, they in fact can diminish some of these accomplishments. Another problem is that there are sexual subjects who are simply not entitled to subjectivity or to rights. For example, the struggle of sex workers or even the trans persons. We've seen how sex workers, especially in the context of the proliferation of anti-trafficking laws, have actually been targeted for either rescue and rehabilitation and presumably then a sort of reincorporation to those very norms that, you know, women's human rights advocacy had set to destabilize a little bit. But what's important is that they are never recognized as sexual subjects who have a claim to rights, who have a claim to families, who have a claim to economic entitlements, or to safety and protection from, say, street and police harassment and violence. And I think the final thing I want to really talk about is how invariably, it seems to me, sexual rights are taken up in a global context in a way that is displaced very often onto first world, third world, us and them divides, where it seems that, in fact, the cultures of one part of the world are projected as more civilized and certainly more mature, while others continue to be cast as, say, racist, repressive, and primitive in their treatment of gender and sexuality. So sexual rights has there's the tension here is that sexual rights can fall into becoming a part of a civilizing mission to rescue others from their cultural context, from their men, from their racial or religious communities. And we've seen an expression of this, say, in the form of rescuing women from the veil in Afghanistan or in Europe, or LGBT from persecution from ISIS. What remains obscured here, however, is how these interventions have really served as justifying US militarism, proliferating Islamophobia, and also reinforcing this idea that somehow women or sexual others are more victimized than their Western counterparts, and they become cardboard cutouts. And finally, I just want to add that I think this is linked to a larger issue of why is it that sexual rights or sexuality even is invariably set up in opposition to faith or culture or other non-liberal ways of being. I think that's something that advocates really need to pay more attention to, because there's a risk here. In fact, this I think is what has happened, is that because of the refusal to engage with these terrains, they've been occupied and defined almost entirely by conservative, orthodox, and right-wing groups. So I think reclaiming this space is really an important task in order to perhaps resolve some of these tensions between sexuality and rights.
Thank you, Ratna. Thank you both. That was an incredibly rich beginning. And I see, the sort of, not only are we well into the 2000s in our number of people listening and hearing, but the number of questions is also ratcheting up. But we don't need to think about those for a few more minutes yet. Let me just sort of ask you, the two of you, something in relation to one another. And just sort of quoting Judith, you said something about the perception that sometimes rights can be seen as deflecting from politics. And Ratna, your version of that was, to my mind, that how might we be able to disrupt certain assumptions about what is and is not freedom or a right or liberation or whatever that is. And so I'm really interested in the rights discourse, not the rights part of it necessarily, but the discourse part of it, which is, do we all have to speak a certain language in order to qualify as a subject of rights? And so just to give you one, and there are many examples of this, but just one example that I find... Sorry, yeah, I'll just finish. One example I want to give, just to sort of say that I find personally fascinating, is that every time sexualities are given recognition or bestowed rights, the language actually turns away from sex and towards love. And so this whole idea of our love needs to be recognized, or we love each other just the way you do, which, obviously has a certain kind of strategic value. But to me, what falls out of that is actually sex. And I wonder what the two of you would make of that in relation to what you were saying, in relation to what the other said, in any which way. Judith, why don't you go first?
Thank you. I think, well, first of all, I'd like to build on Ratna Kapur's point that sexual rights can become part of a civilizing mission. And I guess we can go further and to say, as Jasbir Puar and others have said, that it can become a way of enacting cultural imperialism. And we've also seen in the case of pinkwashing, right, that the state of Israel defends its record on sexual rights, which is, by the way, not perfect, in order to deflect from its criminal record on Palestinian human rights. So, there's always a kind of question of in what strategic political situation does a rights discourse emerge, and what aims does it have other than defending the rights of those subjects who are in need of protection of some kind? or recognition of some kind, to use Ratna Kapur's language. I think there is no way to extricate the rights discourse from a political situation, which means that if we want to accept it or affirm it or work with it, we have to make it work for an anti-imperialism project. In other words, there can be no assertion of sexual rights outside of an anti-imperialist project. And I guess I would say that's the only way it would make sense. Otherwise, it will be recruited. And, you know, I've seen situations and read about them where human rights claims coming from the UN or coming from large international organizations are welcome in local cultures, but I've also clearly seen many radical sexual movements saying, don't bring us that language. That is not who we are. We're not trying to become human. We don't want your human rights because we're not trying to become human on your model of the human. So for instance, in Brazil, I met a group that said, look, we are monstrous. We are outside the human. We are a challenge to your reigning idea of the human up north. And we don't want your human rights. We want a radical sexual politics that can change the world and open up public space and provide healthcare for trans people and sex workers and all of us who are outside the human. Now, this is a different point of view from the one that I think Ratna Kapur was putting forth, that there are many populations who do not qualify as a subject of rights. Now, some of them are knocking on the door to say, I want to be a subject of rights. I want to have human rights. I want to be human. I want to be recognized as human. I have been dehumanized for too long. And others are saying, you know what? I don't want entrance into that category. It is more radical. It is closer to my culture, my language, my history, my community, to stay outside that language and to use other vocabularies that are more deeply empowering and more deeply connecting. That language connects me to a world that is not necessarily the one I want to be connected with, and the community to which I belong, which has secured my survival, which has been the site of my passionate connections, my sexual life, uses another set of vocabularies. So you know, to answer your question, Madhavi Manon, I think that we cannot have a radical sexual political movement without translation, without an understanding that there are different cultural and linguistic forms, and that for some of us, sex and love are distinct, for others they're absolutely bound. We have different kinds of semantic fields in which these work, right? And the point is not to comply with a set of normative ideals like, oh, we just want to be married, we just want to have property, we just want recognition on the model of bourgeois property owners. You know, that won't do for a lot of people who are living their sexual life outside of monogamy, outside of family in that narrow sense, and who belong to larger kinship networks, other kinds of communities of belonging, which are sustaining, which are deeply life-sustaining and also sustaining of the life of desire. I mean, and what use is a sexual rights discourse if it doesn't sustain the life of desire, right? If it wars against the life of desire and the language and community in which desire is living, then it's not doing its job, it's actually hurting.
Thank you. Ratna.
Thank you so much for that, Judith. Professor Butler, I mean, I think in response to your question, Madhavi, and also what you just said, Professor Butler, is that I think this is one of the reasons why we need to reorient our way of engaging with rights. You know, rights don't necessarily confer humanity. They, as I said at the very outset, it's important that they are tools that we don't surrender for two reasons, because they're radical if you've never had them. But more importantly, I think, is for those of us who are within the human rights community, they need to be engaged as an arena of power that can't be relinquished. Not because they necessarily bring about radical change, or they bring about revolution, or they change our lives. In fact, to not engage or to disengage could also have serious consequences, which again is the idea that there are other more conservative and orthodox groups who do continue to use or have learned, in fact, to use rights discourse to advance their deeply conservative agendas, which can be harmful even for those communities who wish to survive outside of it. Will no longer be able to necessarily flourish if we cede that terrain. So I think it's about reorienting how we engage with rights, rather than seeing them as this tool that will lead to our emancipation, or that's progressive. And that's one way of also pushing back on the cultural imperialism as well, when they're not seen as just progressive tools that some cultures don't have and need to have, or some societies don't have and should acquire, but in fact as arenas of power that have deep political consequences for sexual and religious minorities as well, but also for, especially I think, for those non-conforming genders and sexualities. I think my bid would be to, or my argument might be to, how do we bring together what you referred to in Brazil, these flourishing traditions of sexual or thriving spaces for other types of sexualities and genders, with rights in a way that's productive and pushes back against some of these more imperialist, racist, orthodox positions that also inhabit this space.
Thank you, Ratna. Thank you, Judith. We've reached the halfway mark, and there are hundreds of questions awaiting you. Clearly, we're not going to get through even a fraction of them, alas. But Ishan is going to come on now with a curated list of the questions. He's sort of culled them and seen what might work best, grouping things together and seeing what might work best for the largest number of people. So Ishan, all yours.
Right, thank you. I think these presentations have, in a way, already addressed a bunch of these questions, but I'm going to try and repeat the ones which are most representative, according to me, and hopefully get a response. So this one is from Vedant. How does one account for the violence of categorization that the rights discourse perpetuates on groups that don't self-identify with Western categorizations or interventions? So as an example, they gave self-identifying Hijra or Kinder community members who now have been coerced to shift to the self-presentational category of trans in order to access a great network of actors in the context of the NGOization of the trans rights movement. And I think we can go one question by question. So.
Ishan, was this addressed to both speakers or to one in particular?
Yes, so they haven't mentioned any one speaker, so I think we can collect comments
so
from
both of you.
them.
Great. The only thing I would ask is that if you could keep your responses brief, which both of you have been so good at doing, that way we can just get to a maximum number of questions. So all yours.
I see that Ratna is giving me the floor. All right. Well, I do think it's one thing to talk about the violence of categorization as such. It's another thing to realize that in order to receive recognition as a subject of rights, you must conform to language that actually effaces your self-understanding or makes you translate out of yourself in a way that is actually a violation of your understanding of selfhood. And I think that this does happen when NGOs in their progressive moments, bringing us back to the question of what is progressive, in their progressive moments require that, that people who are living within a wide range of vocabularies for their desire, their love, their basic kin relations are having to become suddenly gay, lesbian, even trans. I know that trans is very often understood as a kind of fixture of northern urban centers, and that there are many other vocabularies that that are effaced through that translation. I think this is one reason why the NGOs cannot be the ones who have the power to decide how we think about rights. Now, if we recast sexual rights as collective rights, then those rights get defined by social movements that must have a grassroots beginning and grounding throughout, which means that they are inflected by multiple categories. Now, the last thing I would say about this is that I do not think you need to identify with a subject position in order to assert sexual rights. In other words, if we have a collective understanding of what rights discourse can do and what it cannot do, that does not mean we are a collective subject or that we all identify with a particular version of the subject. I think you can have a rights discourse without mandatory identification and even a collective subject. And if I had more time, I would elaborate.
Yep, I'll do a very quick sort of addition to that and just say that that's absolutely correct. I think that we don't need to, HITRA doesn't have to inhabit the space of trans, or become trans. Trans may be the language that gives access to resources and benefits that may be actually very important, but you can surrender that at any moment of time. It's a political category. It maybe gives you access and nothing more. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind, as you've just said, that these are fluid categories. They're not etched in stone. And in fact, I think that's the great value of thinking in terms of rights as discourse and in terms of norms rather than as really fixed identities, fixed biological identities with specific characteristics. And I also feel that it's very important what you mentioned, Judith, just now about we don't need the middleman all the time or the middle person all the time, which are the NGOs. Yes, they may do good work, but they're there to service and facilitate, not to occupy and be central. They may actually provide at moments, some moments, protection from harm and violence. But you're absolutely right that what needs to be foregrounded is the voice of the community.
Right, thank you so much for that. And I think the next question can lead from your point about religion, Professor Kapur, so it's addressed to you. I understand the point on how religion or culture is placed in opposition to claims on sexuality rights. But in India, a big part of the LGBTQIA+ rights movement couched itself in mythological figures and stories to explain the need to recognition. How do you see this, especially in the light of becoming another civilization mission by one religious group on another?
That's a really great question. And I guess one of I would say that this is, I'm speaking about this really strategically, is that when we've heard sometimes arguments, say in the courtroom or even in the broader public space around sexual rights, the answer, the response back has been, but this isn't part of our culture, it's not part of our faith, it's not part of our heritage. I think maybe we need to be more vocal in terms of challenging that, because that seems to present an idea there's only one way of being and doing desire, sex, and love, rather than multiple fluid ways of doing genders and doing sexualities. And I think it's absolutely, it's very useful to invoke different stories and mythologies to advance your sexual and gender spaces, to counter this more homogenous way of asserting sex and sexuality.
I think there are many issues raised by this important question. One has to do with the status of secularism and how secularism works in India, the second actually has to do with whether the LGBT plus movement is coalitional, not just internally, but coalitional with movements that are seeking to address poverty or criticizing Hindu nationalism or the hideous rules that have been and laws that have been passed against the migration of Muslims to India and the Islamophobic discourse. I mean, it seems to me that in the same way that a sexual rights politics has to be anti-imperialist, it also has to be against notions of ethnic purity, which turn out to be forms of racism, really, or ethnic hatred. And if we're against a repressive state apparatus and we want a livable life, because of the sexualities that we are living, it seems to me that the we who are living them are multiple, and we come from complex histories, and that complexity has to be affirmed in a broad coalitional frameworks. Some would call it intersectional. I guess I'm old style. I call it coalitional, but I think that we have to see that these struggles are linked and that there's no way around it. Now, I don't have a problem with mythology being used as a way of understanding, sexuality. I actually think there are multiple vocabularies, and I don't think there's one secular discourse for understanding sexuality, and I don't think we're all on the road towards enlightened secular discourse in that way. At the same time, there is another version of secularity, which allows us to say there should be no discrimination on the basis of ethnicity and religion. And that version, I think we do need to affirm and make ourselves part of a broader struggle.
Thank you for that. And so the next question, I think, is addressed to both the panelists, and this is from a person looking for examples, I think. Anita Dhai asks, do you think rights for sexuality of people with disabilities are really problematized within both human rights discourse and feminism generally?
Sorry, I missed that because you froze.
I'll just repeat the entire question. Do you think rights for sexuality of people with disabilities are really problematized within human rights discourse and feminism?
Well, I see increasing number of movements that are either movements on the part of people with disabilities or are incorporating disability perspectives um, into their own movements. So I do see this as something that is claiming more attention and becoming more important. If we think about rights to expression, rights to mobility, rights against discrimination, and rights against sexual exploitation as well, which is a real issue for many people who are disabled. And if we think as well about the norm of the human under which we all are supposed to be functioning, I mean, it very often comes with very strong images of able-bodiedness. But in fact, our bodies are highly diverse in what they can do and not do, and how they move or with what support they move, and how they express themselves or with what support they express themselves. So many of our, what we would call our basic rights as embodied beings, are tied up with the disability movement and its demand for us to rethink not only what the ideal human body is, but also what kinds of social support we need in order to function well as living creatures in the world. What kind of infrastructural support? How are the streets paved if they are paved? How do people move? What assumptions are made about what is necessary to move? These are fundamental issues that disability rights discourse and the movement has made very central. And I think that the LGBTQIA movement really is intersectionally bound up with this movement, not only because they are us and we are they. We are bound together many queer disabled people at the front of the movement, but because we're trying to rethink an embodied politics of living. And so we're together in struggling for that vision.
Yeah, I think also some of this is tied up in the way we understand equality and the sort of body that's recognized in equality rights claims. That body is invariably able-bodied, invariably male as well. And so I think it's hugely important to make this argument for disabilities, but also all those other bodies which are different from this standard. And that requires an engagement with equality rights discourse in a way which advances or advances an idea of difference that has been the basis of disadvantage, and that any claims that are being made are not favors, but in fact are integral to equality rights and for the thriving and for the lives of those who are different from that standard that has informed equality both historically and in the contemporary period. There's always been one. And it's about toppling that. I think there's a lot in terms of feminist equality discourse analysis, which is very helpful, but it's really not gained much traction. That's the problem in either the courts or even, unfortunately, in human rights arenas. And that's because there are other groups pushing against this kind of expansion of equality analysis based on disadvantage. Which of course would create all sorts of, entail all sorts of structural and systemic changes.
Thank you for that. And I hope this is not the last question, but this is a question addressed to the panel, I think, so we can take this. Wouldn't recognizing sexuality as a right locate the expression of sexuality within a normative structure, thereby limiting and inhibiting its myriad expressive possibilities? Why not think of sexuality as a freedom?
Why not think of sexuality as a
freedom?
It's a great question. You know, the problem is that sometimes we need terms like rights in order to advance certain kinds of politics, to gain certain kinds of protections against violence and discrimination. But that does not mean that they describe who we are. So, and it would be a mistake to take the notion of rights and say, oh, sexuality is a right. Now I understand what sexuality is. No. The rights discourse doesn't tell us what sexuality is. It opens the space for us to understand sexuality, to define sexuality, to live it through any number of other languages, vocabularies, practices, institutions. It doesn't have descriptive power. It doesn't tell us who we are. It's not an ontology. Now, it can become ontologized, right? It can function in such a way that, oh, sexuality is a right. Here's my sexuality. It is a right. I mean, it wouldn't exactly work, right? I mean, when you try to open up a sexual relationship with somebody, you could say, you know, I have a right. I have a right to you. No, you wouldn't say that. I have a right to express my sexuality. I don't think that's a good way to start a date. It's not going to get you very far. Right, your sexuality is your language of desire, your language of embodiment, of relationality, of how you live in the world as a corporeal being with passions and fears and anxieties, right? And let's remember sexuality has passion, fear, anxiety, hope, memory, all of which is in there. The rights discourse will never be able to give us the rich phenomenological description of sexuality that is going to vary through cultures and vocabularies, and which is our job as people who study sexuality to uncover and understand and support in some important ways. So so I do think we need to be very careful about distinguishing, or careful to distinguish between rights as a mobilizing political term that has its strategic and political meaning and focus, and ask ourselves, in what framework do we want it to function, and how can we do that so that it's not imperialist and civilizing, or it's not effacing, and how to distinguish that from our understanding of sexuality, which is extra juridical, right? It's extra legal. it's no contract, no rights discourse will ever describe fully what we are trying to defend through the rights discourse.
I agree to some extent with that, except that I would also say that we are fearful that when we invoke rights, that gets translated into law, and law is an authoritative discourse, and then it tells us how we're supposed to be, practice our desires, practice our sexuality, perform our genders. And so I think there's a fear of that then becoming the norm. And once again, us having to maybe, fight new battles to try and dislodge that. So the problem is that it is an authoritative arena. And that's why again, I'll say this, because it is authoritative, is the reason you need to engage with it. But it's not the reason that you need to internalize what it says. Have to be on guard all the time, because, as I say, once rights translates into law, like we've had the law on the transgender law enacted recently in India, it has devastating implications for these, especially non-conforming genders and sexualities, who may not have the power to fight back, and that's a real problem. You still want to, you're hoping that rights and law become enabling rather than disabling. But that's why we need to be very cautious what we're taking up. Is it important to move into same-sex marriage, for example, in countries which have decriminalized homosexuality? Or are there other issues that perhaps need to be addressed, or which would be less risky, that could be taken up and they become priorities in the sexual rights agenda?
Right. We have 5 minutes left, so I think we can take one more question. Yeah. Okay. So if you want to think of rights as something that ensures that lives matter, and matter is within quotes, that rights must make life livable and free from violence and discrimination, are we then seeing rights as only as a kind of protection, thereby thought of negatively, as opposed to positive construction that is endowed irrespective of historical oppression?
I'll jump in there. I think it's important, this question somewhere gives too much power to rights. I think rights need to be historicized. And if you historicize them, you'll see it's always been the case that there's been a hierarchy of subjects in rights discourse. Those who are fully human, those who are lesser human, those who are subhuman, those who are non-human. That's the way rights has actually functioned. So once again, it's about reiterating how important it is to understand these histories of rights, which are more complicated than sometimes I think we're aware of, and we see them as tools of emancipation and freedom, and then they just don't end up delivering on that promise, because in fact, they actually never held out that hope or promise, except for very specific constituencies, perhaps. So I do think it's maybe giving too much importance to right, even though there's a tradition that says that, you know, the accumulation of more rights equals more freedom, more emancipation, more liberation. If that were the case, then we wouldn't have Black Lives Matters today. We wouldn't have the kinds of violence against sexual minorities and religious minorities that we have today. If that were the case, there has been decades of rights accumulation, and that hasn't led to freedom, which is why this is a moment to, you know, to stop and reflect on what happened, what went not necessarily wrong, but what did we miss? And I also want to add one small point, is that even when we win something in the courtroom, or we win the right to marry, or to be the decriminalization of homosexuality, we also always have to question, what did we lose in the process? And similarly, if we lost, what did we gain by generating those debates? That's what rights can do for us. So let it work for us, rather than buy into the myth of rights as emancipating.
Thank you. That was great. I'd sort of like to end there, but maybe I'll just a small postscript. You know, rights are only one category in a vast vocabulary of political life. So, for instance, we could have said, what are the obligations of the state towards sexual and gender minorities? That would have been a different way of framing this. But also, I want to suggest, because I was saying earlier that rights don't necessarily presuppose a collective subject, that rights are actually forms of agreement that are achieved between a number of parties, right? So they're actually agreements or covenants. When a right is established, it binds all sorts of parties, right? This corporation cannot discriminate. This person is free to move freely in the street. This person is free to marry. This court must accept this marriage. In other words, it binds many parties together. And then the question is, how does it articulate a form of belonging, or a form of mutual concern, or even a form of social recognition to which people are bound, at which point it becomes a social form. It's not just an individual right or an expression of this collective subject. And I would even go further to say that when it works well, it enunciates an ethical imperative, not just to protect in a paternalistic way, right? Like the state should protect us. The problem is we very often need protection from the state, as we've seen in many universities in India, horrible violence against student protesters. But we also, we want to bind powers not to use their violence, and to demand that, right? So what would happen if we understood rights as ethical demand, as political demand on powers to cease their paternalism and their violence and their discrimination practices and their incarceration practices? In other words, that puts rights into a different framework, one that perhaps moves outside of that paternalism, and even fights that paternalism as one of our problems. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Judith and Ratna. I think ending on a note of fighting paternalism is always good. And so I'm happy to stop there. The two of you have brought such rich and articulate and wonderful ideas to the table. Thank you for getting us off to a hot and sizzling start to the Summer of Ishq. I just want to say before we leave that we're going to be back next Thursday, carrying on many of these conversations in a session on the law, in which we'll be in conversation with Arvind Narain and Jyoti Puri. So all that remains is for me to thank Judith Butler, Ratna Kapur, and all of you for attending. Thanks very much, and bye-bye.